Hello again. For our second video on Friedreich's ataxia, we're going to be doing an overview of the different symptoms involved with this disease. I'd like to start off again by pointing out that ultimately the main authority for your symptoms is going to be your physician, and this is really just supposed to be a general guideline of broad information that's a little bit easier to access. And second, that unfortunately, because we're going to be talking about a lot of symptoms that children's face, I really encourage parents to take a look at this video first and decide whether you feel that these topics are appropriate to discuss with your children if they're unfortunately affected by this disease. Having said that, I think it is important that we have a frank discussion and that people be able to be well informed so that they can make the best healthcare decisions for themselves. In this first part, we're going to be talking about symptoms of the nervous system. In order to illustrate that, I think it's important to understand that there's two main parts of the nervous system that are affected above and beyond the rest. And those happen to be a small part of your brain called the cerebellum, which I've drawn a little bit bigger here for emphasis, that really affects that coordination that we talked about in our last video. And secondly, it can also affect the myelin sheath that surrounds our peripheral nerves throughout the body that help act as essentially insulation so that we better receive the electric signals from our nerves in order to get the correct information that we can process. As a result of Friedreich's ataxia negatively impacting these two things, unfortunately that can affect our nervous system and cause the different symptoms that we're going to be talking about today. Of course, our first symptom that we need to talk about is ataxia. It's in the name. Ataxia, as we talked about before, is that discoordination that patients have as a result of the impairment of that myelin in the cerebellum. Pretty much all patients develop this at some point who have Friedreich's ataxia, and it's often the first thing that brings them to the doctor's office in the first place. Kind of as a subcategory of that, coordination isn't just things like juggling or walking in a straight line or things of that nature. It also involves the coordination of swallowing and of speaking. These are usually less pronounced than the larger body movement, being able to walk steadily. That's pronounced with general ataxia, but they are things that patients can face. Thankfully, there are various treatments to help with both difficulty swallowing in a coordinated fashion as well as with speaking. Another thing that, again, kind of goes in that umbrella of ataxia to a certain degree is it can affect our sense of position and vibration. I know my hand is over here even without looking at it because of my body's ability to sense its position with its nerves. Friedreich's ataxia can attack that to some extent, and in a similar vein, it can affect my ability to feel vibration, say if this board was shaking. However, our ability to sense things such as pain and temperature are typically fairly well preserved in Friedreich's ataxia, as they use different nerve fibers that don't tend to be as affected by the disease. All of these are relatively common. Some patients, however, develop other symptoms. Typically less than 50% of people will develop these, or if they do, it tends to be much later in the course of the disease. One of those can be visual impairment. We use nerves from our eyes up into our brain, and those nerves can be affected as well by the lack of that frataxin protein as a result of Friedreich's ataxia. And likewise, we use different nerves in order to coordinate where we're looking at any given time, and those can be affected by the disease as well, causing irregular eye movements or difficulty tracking things as easily as we would like. Hearing loss is, again, relatively less common. Typically less than a quarter of people develop noticeable hearing loss as a result of Friedreich's ataxia, or if they do, it's usually later in the course of the disease. Likewise, some patients have some urinary urgency, feeling like they need to go pee a little bit more frequently than they might like. But again, that tends to be later and not as common as the main symptoms of the discoordination that we talked about. Finally, there's some question as to whether patients have maybe a tiny bit of mild cognitive impairment, a little bit more trouble with memory or with things like difficult math problems or things like that. It's a little bit controversial, and it seems to be not as well characterized or noticed as most of these other symptoms as we've seen up here. We're going to be going over different options for treatment for these in another video. For now, let's go on to potential issues with the cardiovascular system or the heart. For the cardiovascular system, or more specifically the heart, Friedreich's ataxia tends to cause two main problems. The first is an arrhythmia, or essentially a poor rhythm where the heart isn't beating in as well or in as coordinated a fashion as we would like. And the second is a long fancy word called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is really just a way of saying it's overgrowth of the heart muscle causing it to be too thick and to not work as well as we might like. I've drawn a little stylized diagram of what the heart does because frankly I'm not a very good artist, but essentially blood comes in, is pumped through the different chambers to reach the lungs, pumped through a few more chambers before it can be pushed out to the rest of the body. And that function unfortunately can be negatively affected by Friedreich's ataxia. The heart requires nerves in order to function properly, and as we know, those tend to be impacted the most by Friedreich's ataxia. Specifically, the heart requires nerves in order to set a pace for itself and to know how fast to beat. And as a result of that, when those nerves and the sheath around them aren't working properly, we can end up with an arrhythmia. Instead of a nice, even beat that we want, we can end up with something irregular, whether it be too fast or simply beating at a strange rate where it isn't coordinated in a good enough fashion to pump blood through the heart well. Secondly, as a result of having that poor transmission of nerves to the heart, we can ultimately, after a long process, have this hypertrophic cardiomyopathy where the muscles in our heart end up being too thick. In a nice normal heart, which I've drawn a mediocre version of here, we have muscle all throughout the sides of the chambers in order to push properly and make the blood continue through the body. However, over time, if the innervation, or in other words, the electrical signals coming from the nerves is improper, or the energy regulation due to a lack of that frataxin protein makes the cells not work properly, your heart can try and compensate by building up more muscle. Now at first, that seems like it's a good idea. After all, that should make the heart stronger. Unfortunately, as the muscle builds up, you end up with less space within the heart. It's still able to squeeze pretty well and push blood out into the body. It's just not able to relax as well and accept blood into the chambers and fill up. As a result, you end up with a backlog, and that ultimately can cause issues. Now, we have these two kind of more vague abstract terms, but what do they actually mean in terms of symptoms? Well, arrhythmias can end up having things like your heart beating way too fast, and that can be very uncomfortable. Or as we talked about, if there's poor coordination, you won't be able to push blood out up into your body as well, and can cause things like shortness of breath or fatigue, especially with exercise. Likewise with the cardiomyopathy, or the overgrowth of the heart tissue, as a result of not being able to fill up blood as easily as we would like, it's not able to push the blood out, and again, you're not able to provide enough blood for your body, meaning that there's not enough oxygen being supplied to the different tissues. That can cause problems with, again, feeling the fatigue or the shortness of breath, or sometimes having fluid backing up and not being pumped through appropriately. While patients often don't notice these symptoms at first, it usually takes multiple years for them to build up over time because your body's able to at first compensate. As a result of that, most patients don't first have issues with their heart, or at least that they can see just from their regular exercise or something of that matter. It usually presents later, whether that be in the 20s or 30s, that the heart's function starts to be a little bit more impaired, and things like walking upstairs or going for a run are going to be significantly more affected. And unfortunately, in the long run, this is often what ends up causing patients the most trouble. While nearly all Friedreich's ataxia patients eventually develop some degree of cardiac or heart issues, thankfully only about 8 to 32% of patients develop issues with their pancreas and insulin, or in other words, having trouble with diabetes. I realize 8 to 32 is a pretty broad range, but since it's a relatively rare disease, it's hard to get great estimates. The pancreas is an organ we don't often think about in our everyday life, but it sits here in our abdomen and is in charge of a whole bunch of different jobs, but one of the main ones is controlling our insulin. Insulin, you may have heard of, is important for controlling how much sugar we have floating around in our blood at any given time. We have sugar in our blood, but it can also be directed into our cells. When your pancreas releases insulin, the sugar is then pushed into the cell, assuming that the cell gets the proper signal. While the exact mechanism isn't really understood particularly well, it's thought that the lack of that frataxin protein that results from having Friedreich's ataxia means that your pancreas isn't able to function as properly as it should. As a result, it usually doesn't release as much insulin as it should, and therefore you don't have that drive to send the sugar into the cell where it belongs, so that you can have that nice balance of sugar in your blood and sugar in the cells as well. There's also some thought that maybe it affects the ability for the cell to recognize that it's supposed to be accepting it. So even if insulin comes and tells the cell, hey, take this sugar in, sometimes the cell might ignore that. As a result, most patients who have this issue do have to take insulin in order to properly maintain the right amount of sugar in their blood. For the last part of this video, we're going to be talking about the musculoskeletal symptoms associated with Friedreich's ataxia. Your muscles require the innervation or the connection caused by the nerves in order to function properly. And when that connection gets impacted by the lack of proper insulation around those nerves, unfortunately, they don't respond or grow in the way that they should. This can present in multiple different ways, which we'll go through one by one. For starters, the vast majority of patients unfortunately develop both kyphosis and scoliosis to different degrees. These are fancy words to say misalignment or improper curve of the spine. Kyphosis in particular is when someone is too far hunched forward, often seen with the elderly, for example. In other words, it's a front to back misalignment where you're leaned too far forward, whereas scoliosis tends to be more side to side. Sometimes these are corrected surgically, other times they can be managed more symptomatically. Also, it's not uncommon for patients to have different issues with their extremities. With your feet, there's something called pes cavus, forgive my poor drawing, where your arches are a little bit too high. For some patients, this isn't really an issue and they don't have any difficulty walking as a result of it. For others, it can cause some discomfort or pain as they aren't able to have flat enough feet in order to distribute the force on their feet while walking as well. Similarly, you can have issues with contractures of both your toes or your hands and fingers. Hammer toe is a phrase just to say that your toe is a little bit too curled and isn't able to extend as well as you might like. And similarly, some patients have issues, similar issues with their hands or with their fingers. While these symptoms can often present in young adults or in children, they unfortunately do tend to get worse over time, and it's not uncommon for patients to require some wheelchair support by their mid-20s or later. Again, this isn't something that's universal for all patients and something that you can talk with your physician about, and there are multiple types of physical therapy to address all these, which we'll be going over in more depth in our next video.